The candles in the ballroom went out one by one as Alina Ashworth was pulled by the wrist through a side door, her father's grip tight enough to bruise. Behind her, the music had already stopped. Whispers filled the space where the waltz had been, and every head in that glittering room turned to watch her go. "You have ruined us," Charles Ashworth said, his voice low and shaking with anger. "Do you understand what you have done tonight?" Alina said nothing. She could still feel the warmth of Alexander Vane's hand where it had rested against hers only minutes before, in the shadowed alcove behind the orchestra. She could still hear his voice, quiet and certain, telling her that nothing else in his life had ever felt as right as she did. Then the curtain had been pulled back. Then the gasps, then her father's face, pale with fury, framed in candlelight. Now she stood in a carriage rattling through dark London streets, her mother weeping softly beside her, her father silent and rigid across from them both. Nobody asked how she felt. Nobody asked if she loved him. All that mattered was the scandal and how quickly it could be buried. "The Duke of Jedburn is promised to another family," her mother said at last, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. "Everyone knows this. Lady Priscilla Grant has been chosen for him since they were children. What were you thinking, Alina?" "I was not thinking of duty," Alina said quietly. "I was thinking of him." Her father's hand struck the carriage seat beside him, not touching her, but close enough to make her flinch. "There is no room for feeling in this family's survival. By morning, all of London will know that our daughter was caught in an embrace with a man who belongs to another woman. Do you understand what this means for your sisters, for your family's name?" Alina turned her face to the window, watching the gaslights blur past. She understood perfectly well. She understood that love in her world was a luxury reserved for those who did not need to worry about reputation, inheritance, or the delicate balance of society's approval. She had known, from the very first evening Alexander Vane had spoken to her at a garden party 3 months earlier, that what grew between them could never survive in the eyes of the world they lived in. And yet she had let it grow anyway, because some part of her refused to believe that anything so honest could be wrong. The carriage came to a stop in front of their townhouse, its windows dark except for a single lit lamp in the study. Her father climbed out first, refusing to look at her. Her mother followed, still crying. Alina stepped down last, feeling the cold night air against her flushed cheeks, and for a moment she looked back at the street, half expecting to see a figure on horseback chasing after the carriage. There was nothing. Only silence and the distant sound of another carriage rolling away into the dark. Inside the house, the argument continued long into the night. Alina sat outside her father's study, forbidden from joining the conversation about her own future, listening through the heavy oak door as her parents debated what was to be done with her. She heard her father say the word disgrace more than once. She heard her mother suggest, in a trembling voice, that perhaps if Alina were sent away for a time, the gossip would fade before it could take root. "Where," her father asked, "would we send her that no one would think to look?" "My sister has the estate in Yorkshire," her mother said. "Constance has always wanted company. The house is quiet, remote. No one from society would think to visit a place so far from town." Alina closed her eyes. Yorkshire. She had never been further from London than a summer visit to Brighton. And now, she was being sent away like a piece of furniture no longer wanted in the parlor, hidden in a distant room where visitors would not see it. When her father finally called her into the study, his face had lost some of its anger, replaced now with something colder and more final. He did not look at her when he spoke. "You will leave for Yorkshire within the week," he said. "You will stay with your Aunt Constance for as long as it takes for this scandal to be forgotten. You will not write to the Duke of Jedburn. You will not attempt to see him. If you do either of these things, you will no longer be welcome in this house." "Father—" "This is not a discussion, Alina." He finally looked up, and what she saw in his eyes was not cruelty but something closer to fear, fear of ruin, fear of what the world would say about a family that could not control its own daughter. "You have a choice. You can accept this quietly and preserve what remains of your reputation, or you can fight me and lose everything. Choose wisely." Alina stood very still, her hands clenched at her sides. She thought of Alexander's face in the candlelight of the alcove, the way he had looked at her as though she were the only person in the crowded ballroom. She thought of the promise in his voice, though he had not finished speaking it before they were discovered. She would never know now what he had meant to say. "I will go," she said finally, her voice steady even though her heart was breaking. "But I want it understood that I do this for my sisters, not because I believe I have done anything shameful." Her father did not answer. He simply turned back to his papers, dismissing her with silence. That night, Elinor lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening in her mind. She thought about how quickly happiness could be taken away, how one stolen moment of honesty could unravel months of careful discretion. She thought about Alexander, wondering if he was lying awake somewhere in his grand townhouse, staring at his own ceiling, wondering the same thing she was. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the carriage, and she refused to give her father the satisfaction of seeing her broken the next morning. Instead, she rose before dawn and began, quietly and methodically, to pack her belongings for a journey she had never wanted to take, to a place she had never wanted to see, away from the one person who had ever made her feel as though she mattered for who she was rather than what she represented. By the time the sun rose fully over London, casting pale light across the rooftops and chimneys, Elinor Ashworth had already accepted what she believed to be the truth of her situation. She would go to Yorkshire. She would disappear from society's memory. And somewhere in London, the Duke of Jedburn would move on with his life, marry the woman his family had chosen for him, and forget that a woman named Elinor had ever existed at all. She did not know, as she folded her gowns into her trunk with trembling hands, that in a townhouse not far from her own, a man was standing at his window with the same sleepless eyes, refusing to accept the same fate that she had already resigned herself to. She did not know that Alexander Vane had spent the entire night pacing his study, ignoring the letters from his family demanding explanations, thinking only of the moment the curtain had been pulled back and Elinor's hand had slipped from his. She did not know that he had already begun making plans of his own, plans that had nothing to do with obedience and everything to do with finding her again, no matter how far they sent her, no matter how many oceans of distance and duty stood between them. All Elinor knew, as her carriage rolled out of London 3 days later, was that she was leaving behind the only happiness she had ever truly chosen for herself. She watched the city fade into the horizon through the small carriage window, her throat tight, her eyes dry from refusing to weep. The countryside stretched out ahead of her, unfamiliar and vast, and somewhere behind her, though she could not have known it yet, a decision was already being made that would change the course of both their lives forever. The road to Yorkshire was long, and Elinor spent much of it in silence, watching the world change outside her window. The crowded streets of London gave way to open fields, then to rolling hills dotted with grazing sheep, then to forests so dense the light barely reached the carriage floor. Her maid, a quiet young woman named Alice who had been sent along to accompany her, did not attempt conversation, sensing that her mistress needed the silence more than company. Elinor thought often of her sisters during the journey, of the letters she had left for each of them, explaining as gently as she could why she was being sent away. She thought of her mother's tear-streaked face at the door, unable to say a proper goodbye. She thought of her father, who had not come to see her off at all, choosing instead to remain in his study with the door firmly closed. Mostly, though, she thought of Alexander. She replayed their final conversation over and over, trying to remember every word before the interruption. He had taken her hand and told her that he did not care what his family expected of him, that he had never felt about anyone the way he felt about her. She had believed him completely in that moment, and even now, days later and miles away, she still believed him. But belief and possibility were different things entirely. A duke did not simply walk away from a betrothal his family had arranged since childhood. A duke did not choose a woman with no title, no great fortune, and now, no reputation left to speak of. As the carriage rounded a bend and the vast, empty countryside of Yorkshire spread out before her, Elinor pressed her hand against the cool glass of the window and allowed herself, finally, one single tear. Then she wiped it away, straightened her spine, and prepared herself to become someone new in a place where no one knew her name, or the scandal that had chased her out of London. She did not look back. She could not bear to. But if she had, she might have noticed, far in the distance behind her carriage, a lone rider on a dark horse, following the same road north, keeping just far enough behind to remain unseen. Yorkshire greeted Alina with grey skies and the smell of wet earth. The carriage rattled up a long gravel drive lined with bare oak trees, their branches reaching over the path like fingers, and at the end of it stood a stone house far smaller and plainer than anything Alina had known in London. It looked tired, weathered by wind and rain, but there was something honest about it too, something that did not pretend to be more than it was. Aunt Constance was waiting at the door before the carriage had even come to a full stop. She was a tall woman with silver hair pinned loosely at the back of her head and sharp, kind eyes that studied Alina carefully as she stepped down from the carriage. "So," Constance said, not unkindly, "you are the niece who fell in love with a duke and got caught doing it." Alina felt her cheeks flush. "I did not think the story had traveled this far north already." "Your mother's letters travel faster than any carriage," Constance said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Come inside before you catch a chill standing there looking so miserable. We will discuss the rest over tea." The house was warmer inside than its exterior suggested, filled with soft furniture, shelves crowded with books, and the smell of wood smoke drifting from the parlor fire. Alina was given a room on the second floor that overlooked a garden gone slightly wild with autumn growth, and for the first time since leaving London, she found herself able to breathe without the tightness that had gripped her chest for days. Over tea that evening, Constance asked no further questions about the scandal, and Alina was grateful for it. Instead, her aunt spoke of the village nearby, of the small shops and the church with its crooked steeple, of the neighbors who would no doubt be curious about a new face but too polite, or too indifferent, to pry too deeply. "You will find life here very different from what you are used to," Constance said, pouring a second cup of tea. "There are no balls, no operas, no endless parade of visitors leaving their cards. There is only the land, the weather, and whatever you choose to make of your days. Some find that unbearable. I have always found it a relief." Alina looked out the window at the darkening garden. "I do not know what I will make of my days here, Aunt Constance. I did not choose to come." "No," Constance agreed. "But you are here now, and there is little use spending your time wishing you were somewhere else. I have found that grief, whatever its cause, softens faster in fresh air than in a stuffy drawing room where everyone is watching to see how you bear it." The weeks that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Alina rose early, when the light was still pale and the frost still clung to the grass, and walked the length of the garden before breakfast. She helped Constance with small tasks around the house, tasks she had never been permitted to do in London, where servants handled everything from mending to arranging flowers. She found, to her own surprise, that she did not mind the work. There was a kind of peace in using her hands, in seeing the direct result of her effort, that the endless social performances of London had never given her. Still, in the quiet moments, thoughts of Alexander crept in uninvited. She would be folding linen, or walking along the hedgerow at the edge of the property, and suddenly she would remember the sound of his voice, the particular way he had looked at her as though she were the most interesting person in any room he entered. She wondered if he thought of her at all now, or if the demands of his family and his position had already erased her from his daily life. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself, every night before sleep, that she needed to let the memory fade, the way her mother had promised the scandal itself would fade. It was on one such morning walk, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, that Alina first met Edmund Clark. She had wandered further than usual, following a narrow path that led toward the edge of the village, and had stopped to examine a cluster of wildflowers growing along a low stone wall when a voice behind her made her jump. "You will want to be careful of those," the voice said. "Pretty as they are, they attract more bees than you might expect." Alina turned to find a young man standing a respectful distance away, dressed simply but neatly, carrying a leather bag that marked him, she would later learn as the local doctor's son and assistant. He had an open, friendly face and eyes that crinkled easily when he smiled, which he did now, apologetically. "I did not mean to startle you," he said. "I am Edmund Clark. My father is the doctor here in the village. You must be the niece staying with Mrs. Hartley." "Eleanor Ashworth," she said, offering a small, cautious smile in return. "News travels quickly here, it seems." "It is a small village," Edmund said with a shrug. "Not much happens, so when something does, everyone hears of it within a day. I hope you do not mind the attention. It is well meant, mostly." They walked together for a short while, back toward the edge of the Hartley property, and Eleanor found herself surprised by how easy the conversation was. Edmund did not ask about London, did not pry into why she had come to Yorkshire so suddenly in the middle of the season. He spoke instead of the village, of his work assisting his father, of the strange cases he had seen, and the ordinary ones that made up the bulk of his days. There was no performance in the way he spoke, no calculation behind his words, and Eleanor realized with something like relief that she did not need to guard herself around him the way she had learned to guard herself in London drawing rooms. "You will find the village dull after London, I expect," Edmund said as they reached the gate. "Perhaps," Eleanor admitted, "though I confess London was not always as wonderful as it appeared from the outside." Edmund studied her for a moment, something thoughtful in his expression, but he did not press further. "Well, if you find yourself in need of company, or simply someone to point out which flowers are safe to admire from a distance, you know where to find me." She watched him walk away down the lane, his bag swinging at his side, and found herself smiling despite everything that had brought her to this place. It was a small thing, an ordinary conversation with a stranger, but it felt like the first genuine moment of lightness she had experienced since the night of the ball. That evening, she wrote a letter to her sister Margaret, describing the village, the garden, the quiet rhythm of her new life, careful to leave out any mention of the ache that still lived beneath her ribs whenever she thought of London, and of the man she had left behind there without a proper goodbye. She did not know, as she sealed the letter and set it aside for the morning post, that in London, that very night, Alexander Vane was standing before his family in the grand dining hall of Jedburn House, refusing for the first time in his life to bow to their expectations. He had received word, through a careful and discreet inquiry made by a trusted servant, of where Eleanor had been sent. He had said nothing of this to his parents, who still believed he intended to proceed with his betrothal to Lady Priscilla Grant as planned. He had simply begun, quietly and methodically, to make arrangements of his own, arrangements that would take him far from London, far from duty, and north toward the one thing he had never before allowed himself to want more than his own name and title. His mother, the Duchess, had noticed the change in him almost immediately, the distracted way he answered questions at dinner, the hours he now spent alone in his study, with maps spread across his desk instead of ledgers. She had not yet guessed the reason, but she sensed, with the particular instinct mothers seem to possess, that something in her son had shifted, and that whatever it was, it would not be easily reasoned away. Meanwhile, in Yorkshire, Eleanor continued to settle into her new life, unaware that the careful order she was building for herself, brick by quiet brick, was about to be disturbed by the arrival of the very man she had been sent away to forget. She spent her days walking the fields, helping her aunt, and slowly becoming acquainted with Edmund Clark, whose easy company offered a comfort she had not expected to find so far from everything she once knew. But even as the weeks passed and the ache in her chest began, slowly, to soften, there remained a small and stubborn corner of her heart that refused to let go entirely of the memory of candlelight, and a hand that had held hers so gently in the moment before everything fell apart. Autumn deepened into a colder season, and Yorkshire wrapped itself in frost and pale morning light. Eleanor found that her days had taken on a shape she had never known before, one built not around invitations and appearances, but around small, steady pleasures. She read books from her aunt's crowded shelves late into the evening. She learned to bake bread under the patient instruction of the cook, A round, cheerful woman named Mrs. Fenwick, who scolded her gently for her clumsy hands and praised her just as warmly when her efforts finally succeeded. She walked the lanes near the village almost daily, and more often than not, those walks led her, whether by accident or quiet design, into the path of Edmund Clark. Their friendship grew easily, without pressure or expectation. Edmund would tell her about the patients he had seen that week, the farmer with the injured hand, the elderly widow who insisted her cough was nothing serious despite every sign to the contrary. Alina found herself listening with real interest, asking questions, offering opinions that Edmund seemed genuinely to value. No one in London had ever asked her opinion on anything of substance. She had been admired for her appearance, her manners, her skill at the pianoforte, but never for her mind, and she was surprised to discover how much she had craved that kind of attention without knowing it. "You have a sharp way of thinking," Edmund told her one afternoon, as they walked along the frost-hardened path near the churchyard. "Sharper than most young ladies I have met, and certainly sharper than you let on at first." "I did not realize I was hiding it," Alina said, though she suspected she knew exactly what he meant. In London, a woman's cleverness was often treated as a flaw to be concealed rather than a virtue to be admired. She had learned, without ever being told directly, to soften her opinions, to laugh at jokes she did not find amusing, to appear agreeable above all else. "Perhaps you were," Edmund said gently, "but you need not hide it here." Alina found herself smiling at that, a real smile, unguarded. There was something steady and undemanding about Edmund's company, something that asked nothing of her except honesty, and she found herself, more and more, looking forward to their conversations. She did not mistake this comfort for the same feeling she had carried for Alexander, but she allowed herself, cautiously, to wonder if perhaps her heart was capable of more than one kind of happiness. Aunt Constance watched these developments with quiet interest but said little, until one evening, as they sat together by the fire, she set down her needlework and studied Alina with unusual directness. "You seem lighter than when you arrived," she said. "I suppose I am," Alina admitted. "This place is not what I expected." "And young Mr. Clark, does he have something to do with that lightness?" Alina felt her cheeks warm. "He is a good friend, Aunt Constance, nothing more." Constance said, in a tone that suggested she did not entirely believe this but had no intention of arguing the point. "Friendship is not nothing, Alina. Sometimes it grows into more, sometimes it does not, and either way there is no shame in it. But I will say this. A heart that is still healing from one wound is not always the best judge of what it wants next. Be gentle with yourself and with him." Alina thought about those words long after the fire had burned low and she had retired to her room. She sat by the window, looking out at the dark garden, and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to think honestly about Alexander. She wondered if he had already married Lady Priscilla Grant, or if the arrangement was still being negotiated by their families in the slow, careful way such things were always negotiated among people of their station. She wondered if he ever thought of the alcove behind the orchestra, of the words he had not finished saying before they were interrupted. She told herself, as she had told herself many times before, that it did not matter now. She had a new life here, however small and quiet, and she intended to build it into something worth having, regardless of what happened in London without her. She did not know that, at that very moment, Alexander Vane was 2 days into a journey north, riding alone but for a single trusted servant, having left London under the cover of a supposed hunting trip to a family property in the North Country. He had told his parents nothing of his true destination. He had left behind a letter to Lady Priscilla Grant, carefully and honestly worded, explaining that he could not in good conscience proceed with a betrothal his heart did not support, regardless of what it cost him in his family's eyes. He had not yet sent the letter. He carried it with him, sealed, uncertain even now whether he had the courage to see the plan through to its end, or whether duty would reassert itself somewhere along the long road north and turn him back before he ever reached Yorkshire. The journey was harder than he had anticipated. The roads grew rougher the further he traveled from London, and more than once he found himself questioning the wisdom of what he was doing. He was a duke. He had responsibilities to his estate, to his family's legacy, to the hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended, in one way or another, on the decisions made by the head of the Jedburn family. And yet, every time doubt crept in, he thought of Aline's face in the candlelight, the honesty in her eyes when she looked at him, utterly without calculation, and he found the doubt could not hold against the memory. He stopped for the night at a small inn along the road, exhausted from days of hard travel, and it was there that a chance conversation with the innkeeper's wife nearly undid his careful anonymity. She had commented, while serving his supper, on the fine quality of his coat, and asked, with the innocent curiosity of someone unused to strangers passing through, what business brought a gentleman of his evident means so far from the main coaching roads. "Family matters," Alexander said, careful to keep his tone light and unremarkable. "Nothing of great interest." The woman had smiled and moved on to her other duties, apparently satisfied, but Alexander understood in that moment how carefully he would need to guard his identity once he reached the village near Constance Hartley's estate. He could not arrive as the Duke of Jedburn. Word of a duke appearing unannounced in a remote Yorkshire village would travel fast, faster even than the scandal that had sent Aline away in the first place, and it would reach London within days. He needed a different name, a different story, something ordinary enough not to draw attention. He settled, after some consideration, on the name Alexander Hale, a distant enough echo of his own name that he would not stumble over it if addressed suddenly, but common enough to raise no particular curiosity. He would present himself as a gentleman of modest means, perhaps a writer or a surveyor, traveling through the district for reasons of his own. It was a thin disguise, and he knew it would not survive close scrutiny, but he hoped it would be enough to buy him time to find Aline, to speak with her, to discover whether the feelings that had driven him from London still lived in her heart as strongly as they lived in his. He resumed his journey at dawn, the sealed letter to Lady Priscilla still tucked inside his coat, unsent, its fate undecided until he knew what awaited him at the end of the road. The countryside grew wilder as he traveled further north, the fields giving way to open moorland, the sky wider and grayer than anything he had known in London. He found himself, despite his exhaustion, feeling something close to freedom for the first time in years, riding beneath an open sky with no ledger to review, no obligation to fulfill except the one he had chosen for himself. Meanwhile, back in the village, Aline's life continued its quiet unfolding, entirely unaware of the rider drawing steadily nearer with each passing day. She spent an afternoon with Edmund Clark helping to organize supplies at his father's small surgery, laughing at his attempts to teach her the proper names for various herbs and tinctures, most of which she promptly forgot. She wrote another letter to her sister, this one lighter in tone than the last, mentioning, almost in passing, a new friend she had made in the village. She helped her aunt prepare for the coming winter, storing preserves and mending curtains against the coming cold. It was, in every visible way, an ordinary stretch of days. But beneath the surface of that ordinary life, something had begun to shift in Aline, something she could not fully name. She found herself, in quiet, unguarded moments, thinking less often of the ballroom in London, and more often of the particular color of the sky over the moors at dusk, of the sound of Edmund's easy laughter, of the strange and unexpected peace she had found in a place she had never wanted to come. She did not yet know that peace was about to be shattered, not by scandal or ruin, but by the return of the very man she had spent so many quiet weeks trying to forget. She did not know that within days, a stranger calling himself Alexander Hale would arrive in the village, take modest lodgings above the local inn, and begin, carefully and deliberately, to arrange a meeting that would look, to anyone watching, entirely like chance. The village inn was a small, sturdy building with a thatched roof and a sign creaking gently above its door, and it was there that a stranger arrived late one afternoon, his horse worn from travel, his coat dusted with the road. He gave his name to the innkeeper as Alexander Hale, explained that he was a gentleman of independent means with an interest in the local landscape, and asked, with careful casualness, whether the village had any notable families worth calling upon during his stay. The innkeeper, a broad, talkative man named Mr. Dawson, was only too happy to oblige. He rattled off the names of the local gentry, the vicar's family, the retired colonel who lived at the edge of the village, and almost as an afterthought Mrs. Constance Hartley, who lived alone at the old stone house past the churchyard, except that she currently had a niece staying with her, a young lady down from London, very pretty, very quiet, kept mostly to herself and the doctor's son these days. Alexander kept his expression carefully neutral as he accepted his key and thanked Mr. Dawson for the information, though his heart had begun to beat harder at the mention of Alina. She was here. She was close. After days of hard travel and long nights of doubt, the reality of her presence, only a short walk away, struck him with a force he had not fully prepared himself for. He spent his first evening in the village walking its narrow lanes under the cover of dusk, orienting himself to the layout of the place, noting the church, the small row of shops, the path that led, according to Mr. Dawson's directions, toward the Hartley property. He did not approach the house. He knew better than to risk discovery so soon, before he had a plan for how to reveal himself, if he chose to reveal himself at all. That night in his small room above the inn, he finally opened the sealed letter he had carried from London and read it over once more. It was addressed to Lady Priscilla Grant, explaining, as gently and honestly as he knew how, that he could not proceed with their betrothal, that his heart belonged to someone else, and that he hoped, in time, she would understand and forgive him for the position his choice would place her in. He had written it days before leaving London, uncertain then whether he would ever have the courage to send it. Now, sitting in a strange room in a village he had never visited before, closer to Alina than he had been in weeks, he found his resolve had only strengthened. He sealed the letter again and gave it to Mr. Dawson the following morning, along with enough coin to ensure it reached the London post with speed and discretion. There was no turning back now. Within days, his family would know that he had broken his betrothal, and soon after they would begin to suspect why. But by then, he intended to have already spoken with Alina, to know for certain whether the feelings that had driven him this far still lived in her heart, or whether he had made this journey and this sacrifice for nothing. For the next several days, Alexander observed the village carefully, learning its rhythms, its market days, the paths most commonly walked by its residents. He learned, through careful and casual conversation with the innkeeper and other villagers, that Alina often walked in the mornings, sometimes alone, sometimes in the company of the doctor's son, and that she visited the village market on Thursdays, when local farmers brought their goods to sell in the square outside the church. He decided the market would be his opportunity. A chance encounter in a crowded, public place would draw far less attention and suspicion than any deliberate visit to the Hartley house, and it would allow him to gauge Alina's reaction to his presence before committing to any further course of action. If she turned from him in anger, if she wanted nothing more to do with him, he told himself he would accept it and return quietly to London, his family's fury and his own broken heart the only price paid for his foolish hope. But if there remained in her eyes even a fraction of what he had seen the night of the ball, he would know that the risk had been worth taking. Thursday arrived cold and bright, with a pale winter sun doing little to warm the market square but lending it a certain sharp clarity all the same. Alina arrived with her aunt's basket over her arm, sent to purchase eggs and fresh bread, and whatever vegetables the season still offered, her mind occupied with nothing more pressing than the list Mrs. Fenwick had given her that morning. She moved through the market with the easy familiarity of someone who had, over the past weeks, become genuinely comfortable in this small corner of the world. She exchanged pleasant words with the baker's wife, admired a length of wool at the weaver's stall, and was in the middle of examining a basket of late apples when a voice, achingly familiar, spoke close behind her. I have always found that the apples nearest the top of the basket are rarely the best ones. It takes a bit of digging to find what is truly worth having. Alina went very still. She knew that voice. She had heard it in her dreams for weeks, had replayed its every inflection in the quiet hours when sleep would not come. She turned slowly, her heart pounding so hard she was certain the whole market must be able to hear it. And there, standing before her in a plain traveling coat, his hair slightly longer than she remembered, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs entirely, stood Alexander Vane. "You," she whispered, too stunned to manage anything more coherent. "What are you doing here?" "Buying apples, apparently," he said, a faint, uncertain smile touching his mouth, though his eyes remained serious, searching her face as though trying to read every thought behind it. "Though I confess that was not my true purpose in coming." Elinor glanced around quickly, painfully aware of how public the square was, how many eyes might be watching, how quickly word would travel through a village this size if anyone recognized what they were witnessing. "You cannot be here. If anyone learns who you are." "No one here knows who I am," he said quietly, stepping slightly closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear him over the noise of the market. "I have taken lodgings under another name. I have told no one my true purpose. I have thought of nothing but you since the night we were discovered, Elinor, and I would not, simply let you disappear from my life without at least attempting to see you again." Elinor's hands trembled around the handle of her basket. Part of her wanted to turn and walk away immediately, to protect herself from the pain of hoping for something that could never truly belong to her. But another part of her, the part that had lain awake so many nights remembering the warmth of his hand against hers, could not make her feet move. "You have risked everything to come here," she said finally. "Your family, your position, Lady Priscilla." "I have already written to Lady Priscilla," he said. "I have ended our betrothal. My family does not yet know, but they will soon enough, and I have made my peace with whatever consequences follow. I did not come here on a whim, Elinor. I came because I could not imagine a future that did not include you in it, whatever form that future might take." Elinor felt tears gathering in her eyes, tears she fought hard to hold back in the middle of a crowded market square. "You should not have come," she whispered, though even as she said it, she knew the words did not carry the conviction she wanted them to. "Perhaps not," Alexander said softly, "but I am here now. And I would very much like the chance to speak with you properly, away from prying eyes, if you will allow it." Elinor hesitated, torn between the caution she had learned so painfully in London and the powerful, undeniable pull she still felt toward this man who had crossed the length of the country simply to find her. Around them, the ordinary business of the market continued, villagers haggling over prices, children darting between stalls, entirely unaware that a decision of enormous consequence was being made in their midst. "There is a path," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "beyond the churchyard that leads toward the river. It is rarely traveled at this hour. If you were to walk there in an hour's time, you might find that I had also chosen to walk there, entirely by coincidence." A slow smile spread across Alexander's face, the first true smile she had seen from him since his arrival. "Entirely by coincidence," he agreed. "I look forward to this coincidence very much, Miss Ashworth." He inclined his head, a small, formal gesture entirely at odds with the intimacy of their conversation, and turned to walk away through the crowd, leaving Elinor standing alone beside the apple basket, her heart racing, her mind a whirl of fear and hope and disbelief that he had truly come all this way for her. She finished her errands mechanically, barely aware of what she purchased or how much she spent, her thoughts consumed entirely by the promise of the hour ahead. She did not know, as she made her way back toward the Hartley house to leave her basket before setting out again, that Edmund Clark had witnessed the entire exchange from a short distance away, and had watched, with a growing and unpleasant certainty, the way Elinor's whole demeanor had changed the moment the stranger spoke to her. The path beyond the churchyard was quiet, exactly as Elinor had promised, lined with bare hedgerows and the last stubborn leaves clinging to branches that would soon be entirely bare for winter. She walked slowly, her heart still racing from the encounter in the market, glancing frequently over her shoulder to be certain no one had followed her, though she knew even as she did it that such caution was likely useless. If anyone in the village had noticed the stranger's unusual interest in her at the market, No amount of careful timing would fully erase the questions it might raise. She found him waiting near a bend in the river, standing beneath a large oak tree, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the water move slowly over smooth stones. He turned as she approached, and the careful composure he had worn in the market square seemed to fall away entirely, replaced by something rawer, more unguarded. "I was not certain you would come," he admitted. "Neither was I," Alina said honestly, stopping a short distance from him, keeping the space between them deliberate and careful. "I have spent weeks trying to convince myself that I had let you go, Alexander, that I had accepted what could never be, and now you are standing here and I find I do not know what to feel." "I owe you an explanation," he said, "for everything, for the months of silence after that night, though I promise you it was not silence by choice. My family kept me under close watch for a fortnight, certain that if given the opportunity I would attempt exactly what I have now done. I wrote you letters I never sent, because I could not be certain they would not be intercepted and used to make your situation worse than it already was." Alina felt something in her chest loosen slightly at his words, though the fear had not entirely left her. "And Lady Priscilla." "I have told you truthfully," Alexander said. "The betrothal is ended by my own hand and my own choice. I do not say this to pressure you into anything, Alina. I say it because I want you to understand that I did not come here on impulse, chasing some fleeting infatuation I have not properly considered. I have thought of little else for weeks. I have weighed what I stand to lose, my family's approval, my position among my peers, perhaps even my inheritance if my father chooses to be as unforgiving as I fear he might be. And still, none of it weighed as heavily as the thought of a life spent without ever knowing what might have been between us." Alina stepped closer, unable to help herself, though caution still whispered at the edges of her mind. "You must understand my position as well, Alexander. I have already lost so much because of one stolen moment between us. My reputation, my standing among people who once called themselves my friends. If this is discovered, if anyone learns who you truly are and why you have come, the damage will not fall only on you. It will fall on me as well, and this time there may be no quiet estate in the countryside to hide me from it." "I know," Alexander said quietly, "and I would never ask you to bear that risk again without being certain, absolutely certain, that what waits on the other side of it is worth the cost. That is why I have come myself, rather than sending letters that could be lost or intercepted. I needed to look at you, to hear your voice, to know for myself whether what I felt in that alcove was real, or whether I had built it into something larger than it truly was in my memory." "And what have you found?" Alina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander closed the distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she wished it, though she did not. "I have found," he said, "that it was not large enough in my memory at all. That standing here now, I feel it more strongly than I did even that night." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The river continued its quiet movement over the stones, and somewhere in the distance a bird called out against the gray winter sky, but between them the world seemed to have narrowed to nothing but the small space separating their hands. "I have made a life for myself here," Alina said finally, though her voice trembled slightly. "A small one, but a real one. I have found a kind of peace I did not expect to find, and I am afraid, Alexander, that if I let myself hope again and it is taken from me a second time, I will not survive the losing of it." "Then let me prove to you that I do not intend to take it from you again," Alexander said. "Let me stay, quietly, carefully, and let you decide in your own time whether there is still something worth building between us. I will not press you. I will not endanger your position here more than my presence already risks. But I cannot simply leave without knowing that I tried." Alina looked up at him, at the earnestness in his eyes, so different from the careful, guarded expressions worn by every man she had known in London society, and she felt the last of her resistance beginning to crumble, however much caution urged her to hold firm. "There is a stand of trees," she said slowly, "at the edge of my aunt's property, where the boundary meets the old mill path. I sometimes walk there in the late afternoon, when the light begins to fade and most of the village has already gone in for supper. If you were to find yourself walking the same path, entirely by chance, I do not think anyone would think it unusual. A slow smile broke across Alexander's face, warm and genuine. Entirely by chance, he agreed. You have a gift for arranging coincidences, Miss Ashworth. I have had a very good teacher in recent weeks, she said, a small answering smile finally breaking through her caution, in the art of appearing where one is not expected to be. They spoke for a while longer beneath the bare oak tree, careful to keep their conversation light, testing the ground between them slowly rather than rushing toward promises neither of them was yet ready to make. Alexander told her, in careful detail, of the journey north, of the false name he had adopted, of the small room above the inn where he was currently lodged. Elinor told him of her life in the village, of Aunt Constance's quiet wisdom, of Mrs. Fenwick's patient instruction in the kitchen, though she found herself, for reasons she did not fully examine, leaving out any mention of Edmund Clark. When the light began to shift toward late afternoon, they parted with careful formality, walking separate paths back toward the village, though both of them carried with them a lightness that had been absent for weeks. Elinor returned to the Hartley house with her cheeks flushed from more than just the cold, her mind spinning with possibility and fear in equal measure. She did not know that Edmund Clark, walking home from a visit to a patient at the edge of the village, had seen her emerging from the direction of the river path, and had noted, with quiet concern, the particular brightness in her expression that he had not put there himself. He said nothing to her that evening when their paths crossed briefly near the churchyard, only offered his usual friendly greeting, but inwardly he found himself troubled by a question he was not yet ready to ask directly. He had begun, over the past weeks, to hope for something more than friendship between them, though he had been careful never to press the matter, sensing that Elinor's heart carried wounds not yet fully healed. Now, watching her walk past him with that unmistakable glow of secret happiness, he wondered, with a sinking feeling he did not much like, whether those wounds had reopened rather than healed, and whether the cause of it had followed her all the way from London. Over the following 2 weeks, Elinor and Alexander met as often as they dared, always under the careful guise of chance encounters, always in places where the eyes of the village were least likely to fall upon them. They walked the mill path at dusk, spoke quietly beneath the bare branches of the old oak by the river, and once, when a sudden rain forced them to take shelter in an abandoned barn near the edge of the property, they sat together for nearly an hour, talking of nothing and everything, while the storm rattled the old wooden boards above their heads. With each meeting, Elinor felt herself falling more deeply into feelings she had tried so hard to bury during her weeks of quiet exile. Alexander was patient with her, never pressing for more than she was willing to give, content simply to be near her, to listen to her thoughts, to share his own in return. He told her of his childhood, of the pressures of growing up as the heir to a dukedom, of the loneliness that had often accompanied a life surrounded by servants and expectations, but very little genuine warmth. She found herself understanding him in a way she had not fully appreciated during their brief courtship in London, where every conversation had been conducted under the watchful eyes of society, never quite private, never quite honest. But even as their bond deepened, Elinor could not fully shake the weight of what they were risking. Every secret meeting carried with it the possibility of discovery, and she knew that if anyone in the village learned the true identity of the man calling himself Alexander Hale, the consequences would reach far beyond her own reputation. It would touch her aunt, who had taken her in without judgment. It would touch her family in London, already fragile in the aftermath of the scandal that had sent her away in the first place. It was Edmund who finally gave voice to the growing unease that had been building in him for days. He found Elinor alone in the garden one gray afternoon, mending a torn glove, and after a long moment of hesitation, he sat down on the bench beside her, his expression unusually serious. "May I speak plainly with you, Elinor?" he asked. "Of course," she said, though something in his tone made her set down her mending. "I have noticed a change in you these past weeks," Edmund said carefully. "A kind of happiness that was not there before, and also, I think, a kind of fear that follows close behind it. I do not wish to pry into matters that are not my concern, but I consider you a true friend, and I find I cannot simply watch in silence if you are placing yourself in danger." Elinar's heart sank. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that her secret meetings had gone entirely unnoticed. "I do not know what you mean," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "I saw you at the market the day the stranger arrived," Edmund said gently. "I saw the way you looked at him and the way he looked at you. I have lived in this village my whole life, Elinar. I know most every face that passes through it, and I did not know his. A man does not travel this far from any main road, adopt lodgings under a name that does not entirely suit him, and seek out a young lady at the market unless he has come with a very particular purpose in mind." Elinar felt tears gathering unexpectedly at his words, not from anger, but from the exhausting weight of carrying a secret she had never wanted to burden anyone else with. "You are right," she admitted quietly. "He is not who he claims to be. His name is Alexander Vane. He is the Duke of Jedburn." Edmund's eyes widened slightly, though he said nothing at first, absorbing the implications of what she had told him. "The same Duke whose name was attached to your departure from London," he said finally. Not a question, but a quiet confirmation of what he had clearly already begun to suspect. "Yes," Elinar said. "He has followed me here, Edmund. He has ended his betrothal to another woman for my sake, and he has risked everything, his family's approval, his position, to find me again." "And you," Edmund said carefully, "what do you feel for him?" Elinar was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the mended glove in her lap. "I do not fully know," she admitted at last. "I have tried for weeks to forget him, to build a life here that did not depend on the hope of his return, and in many ways I have succeeded. I have found peace here that I did not expect. I have found friendship in you that has meant more to me than I have perhaps allowed myself to acknowledge. But when I am with him, Edmund, I feel something I have never felt with anyone else, something I cannot simply reason away no matter how much caution tells me I should." Edmund absorbed this with quiet dignity, though Elinar could see the effort it cost him. "I will not pretend I am not disappointed," he said finally. "I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that in time you might come to feel for me something closer to what you describe feeling for him. But I would rather see you happy, truly happy, than see you settle for something less simply because it is safer, or because it is what I might wish for myself." "Edmund, you need not say anything more," he said, offering her a small, sad smile. "I only ask that you be careful, Elinar, not only for your own sake but for your aunt's. If this is discovered, and I fear it eventually will be, in a village this small, the consequences will not be gentle, whatever a duke's intentions might be." Elinar reached out and took his hand briefly, grateful beyond words for his understanding, however painful it clearly was for him to offer it. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for your honesty and for your friendship. I do not take either lightly." Edmund nodded, withdrawing his hand gently, and rose from the bench. "I hope, whatever happens, that you find the happiness you deserve, Elinar. I mean that sincerely." He walked away across the garden, and Elinar watched him go with a heavy heart, aware that something precious had shifted between them, even as she could not bring herself to regret the honesty that had passed between them. That evening, Aunt Constance found Elinar sitting alone in the parlor, staring into the fire with an expression that suggested her thoughts were far from the quiet room around her. Constance settled into her usual chair and studied her niece for a long moment before speaking. "I think it is time you told me the truth, Elinar," she said finally. "About the gentleman who has been so conveniently appearing along every path you happen to walk these past weeks." Elinar's head snapped up, startled. "Aunt Constance." "I am old, Elinar, not blind," Constance said, though not unkindly. "I have watched you return from your walks with color in your cheeks that has nothing to do with the cold, and I have heard, from more than one source in this village, of a curious stranger who arrived shortly after you did, and has shown a great deal of interest in a young lady from London. I think you owe me an explanation. Given that it is my household and my reputation, that will bear some of the consequences should this secret come to light. Elinor took a deep breath, and for the second time that day told the truth of who Alexander truly was and why he had come. Constance listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, and when Elinor finished, a long silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. "A duke," Constance said finally, shaking her head slowly. "Elinor, do you understand what you are risking? Not simply gossip, but true and lasting ruin for yourself and quite possibly for this household as well. If his family learns he has followed you here, if they believe you have somehow entrapped him into abandoning a betrothal his family has spent years arranging, they will not treat you gently. They have the power and the influence to destroy what remains of your reputation entirely, and there will be no quiet Yorkshire estate left to hide you from it." "I know the risk, Aunt Constance," Elinor said, her voice steady despite the fear that had settled in her chest at her aunt's words. "But I also know what I feel, and I do not think I can simply pretend it does not exist, not after everything I have already sacrificed for the sake of caution." Constance studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression softened slightly. "You have your mother's stubbornness," she said finally, "and perhaps a bit more courage than she ever had. I will not forbid you from seeing him, Elinor, though I suspect forbidding you would accomplish very little at this point regardless. But I will ask that you exercise far greater care than you have shown thus far. This village is small, and secrets, however carefully kept, have a way of finding their way to the surface eventually." Elinor nodded, grateful for her aunt's reluctant understanding, though Constance's warning settled uneasily in her chest. She did not know, as she climbed the stairs to her room that night, that word of the mysterious stranger's unusual interest in her had already begun to spread beyond the village, carried along the same roads that had brought Alexander north, toward London, and toward a family that would not receive the news of his disappearance and his broken betrothal with anything resembling patience. The letter reached Jedburn House on a cold morning nearly 3 weeks after Alexander had left London, and it arrived not from Alexander himself, but from a servant he had trusted to deliver his broken betrothal to Lady Priscilla Grant. The Duchess of Jedburn read the contents with a growing sense of alarm, her husband pacing furiously behind her as she relayed, in a shaking voice, the news that their son had ended his engagement, and that his current whereabouts remained unknown to the family entirely. It did not take the Duke and Duchess long to piece together the likely truth. Their son's strange behavior in the weeks before his departure, his sudden interest in maps of the northern counties, his refusal to discuss his supposed hunting trip in any detail, all pointed toward a destination and a purpose they had not initially suspected. When a discreet inquiry to a family connection in Yorkshire revealed that a young lady matching Elinor Ashworth's description had recently taken up residence with her aunt in a small village not far from the northern road, the pieces fell into place with painful clarity. The Duke of Jedburn, Alexander's father, was not a man given to patience or forgiveness when his family's name and legacy were at stake. He immediately dispatched a letter to the village, addressed not to his son, but to Constance Hartley directly, informing her in cold and formal language that her household was harboring a runaway heir who had abandoned his duties and his family's honor, and demanding that the matter be resolved before further scandal could spread. The letter arrived at the Hartley house on a bright, cold morning, and Constance read it in silence at the breakfast table before passing it wordlessly to Elinor. Elinor's hands trembled as she read the harsh, formal language, the barely concealed threat beneath its careful phrasing, and she felt the fragile peace of the past weeks beginning to crumble entirely. "They know," she said quietly, setting the letter down. "They know he is here, and they believe I have somehow trapped him into this." "It was only a matter of time," Constance said, though her voice carried more sympathy than blame. "A duke does not simply vanish from London without his family eventually tracing his path. The question now, Elinor, is what you and Alexander intend to do about it." Elinor sent word to Alexander through the innkeeper's discreet assistance, and he arrived at the Hartley house within the hour, his face pale with a mixture of anger and worry as he read his father's letter. "This is exactly what I feared," he said, pacing the small parlor. They will not simply accept my choice quietly. They will do everything in their power to separate us, and if they cannot achieve that through reason, they will attempt it through force or influence. What will you do? Elinor asked, her voice steady despite the fear tightening in her chest. Alexander stopped his pacing and turned to face her directly. I have spent weeks trying to decide how best to protect you from the consequences of my family's disapproval, he said. I considered retreating quietly, returning to London to face their anger alone, sparing you from being drawn further into a battle that was never truly yours to fight. But I find, now that the moment has actually arrived, that I cannot bring myself to abandon what we have built here, however fragile and secret it has been. Alexander, let me finish, he said gently. I have hidden behind a false name for weeks, meeting you in secret as though what exists between us were something shameful, something to be concealed rather than celebrated. I am tired of hiding, Elinor. I am tired of pretending to be someone I am not simply to avoid a confrontation I knew, from the very beginning, would eventually come. I would rather face my family's anger directly, and yours as well if it comes to that, than continue living a lie that dishonors what I truly feel for you. Elinor felt her heart racing, torn between fear of what such a confrontation might bring, and a fierce, unexpected pride in the man standing before her. No longer hiding, no longer calculating, simply honest in a way she had not fully witnessed from him before, even in their most intimate conversations. If you do this, she said carefully, if you declare yourself publicly, there will be no taking it back. Your family may disown you. Society may turn against us both entirely. I have already lost so much because of one moment of discovery, Alexander. I do not know if I have the strength to survive losing more. You will not lose more, Alexander said firmly, closing the distance between them and taking her hands in his. Whatever my family decides, whatever society chooses to say, I intend to stand beside you openly, as your equal and your partner, rather than skulking about the countryside pretending to be a man I am not. I have thought of nothing else these past weeks but building a life with you, Elinor, one built on honesty rather than concealment. I cannot do that while hiding behind a false name, waiting anxiously for the day my family finally discovers the truth. Constance, who had remained quietly in the corner of the room throughout this exchange, finally spoke. If you intend to declare yourself, young man, I would suggest doing so with some care and preparation, rather than simply storming into your family's presence in anger. A public declaration, handled wisely, might yet turn public opinion in your favor rather than against you. A duke who chooses love and honesty over a cold, arranged betrothal is not without a certain romantic appeal to society, whatever your parents might currently believe. Alexander considered this for a long moment, and something like renewed determination settled over his features. You are right, he said. I have been thinking of this only as a battle to be fought against my family's disapproval. Perhaps it would serve better as a declaration made openly, before witnesses, in a manner that leaves little room for quiet manipulation or private pressure. Within days, word arrived that the Duke and Duchess of Jedburn themselves intended to travel north, determined to retrieve their son and end what they viewed as a foolish and damaging entanglement before it could cause any further harm to the family's reputation. Their arrival was expected within the week, and the small village, already buzzing with quiet speculation about the mysterious stranger who had taken lodgings above the inn, found itself on the verge of a scandal far larger than anything its residents had witnessed in living memory. Elinor spent the days leading up to the Duke and Duchess's arrival in a state of nervous anticipation, torn between hope for the future Alexander had promised her and fear of what his parents' arrival might truly bring. She thought often of her own family in London, wondering what word of this new development had already reached them, and whether her father's fury over the original scandal would pale in comparison to what might follow if this latest chapter became public knowledge. Alexander, for his part, spent the days in careful preparation, drafting the words he intended to speak when his parents arrived, determined that whatever confrontation awaited him would be met with calm resolve rather than the defensive anger that had characterized so many of his previous disagreements with his father. He visited Elinor daily now, no longer bothering to disguise the purpose of his visits, a decision that drew increasing attention from the villagers but which he bore with quiet dignity, understanding that the time for secrecy had already passed. On the morning the Duke and Duchess of Jedburn's carriage finally rolled into the village, drawing curious stares from every window along the main street, Elinor stood at the window of the Hartley parlor, her hand pressed against the cool glass, watching the elegant carriage come to a stop outside the inn, and understood with a mixture of dread and determination that the moment they had all been preparing for had finally arrived. The meeting took place in the modest parlor of the village inn, arranged by Alexander himself, who had insisted that whatever confrontation followed would happen on neutral ground rather than in a setting that might place Elinor or her aunt at any disadvantage. The Duke and Duchess of Jedburn arrived precisely on time, dressed in traveling clothes that still managed to convey the full weight of their rank, and their expressions, when they entered the room and found their son standing beside Elinor Ashworth rather than waiting to be collected obediently, made their displeasure immediately clear. "Alexander," the Duke said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "you will explain yourself immediately. You have abandoned your betrothal, disappeared from London without word, and now I find you standing here with the very young woman whose scandal nearly cost this family its standing only weeks ago." "Father," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from every corner of the small room, "I owe you an explanation, and I intend to give you one, but I ask that you hear it fully before passing judgment." The Duchess, who had remained silent thus far, studied Elinor with an expression that was harder to read than her husband's open fury, something between curiosity and cautious assessment. Elinor met her gaze directly, refusing to look away or shrink beneath the scrutiny, though her heart pounded fiercely in her chest. "I have spent my entire life," Alexander began, "fulfilling every expectation placed upon me. I accepted a betrothal arranged for the benefit of two families, not for any true affection between myself and Lady Priscilla, because it was what duty demanded. I attended every event, cultivated every connection, and never once questioned whether the life laid out for me was one I actually wanted, because questioning it seemed a luxury I could not afford as heir to this family. And now you question it," the Duke said sharply, "over a young woman with no title, no fortune, and a reputation already tarnished by scandal." "Her reputation was tarnished," Alexander said, his voice rising slightly for the first time, "because society condemned her for a moment of honest feeling that I share equally in causing. If there is blame to be assigned for that night, Father, it belongs to me as much as to her, and I will not stand here and allow her character to be diminished for a choice we made together." Elinor felt tears gathering at his words, moved by the fierce protectiveness in his voice, though she remained silent, understanding instinctively that this was a battle Alexander needed to fight on his own terms. "I love her," Alexander continued, his voice softening but losing none of its conviction. "I have known it since the night we were discovered, and every day since has only deepened that certainty. I ended my betrothal to Lady Priscilla not out of impulse, but because I could not in good conscience marry a woman I did not love, when I had already discovered what true feeling actually meant. I followed Elinor here, not to disgrace this family further, but because I could not imagine building a life that did not include her in it. If that costs me my inheritance, my position, even my place in this family, I have already made my peace with that price. What I cannot make peace with is a lifetime spent wondering what might have been, had I chosen duty over honesty." The room fell silent following his declaration, the weight of his words settling heavily over everyone present. The Duke's expression remained hard, unmoved by his son's speech, but the Duchess had grown quiet and thoughtful, her sharp eyes moving between her son and the young woman standing beside him with such evident composure, despite the enormous stakes of the conversation. "You would truly give up everything," the Duchess said finally, addressing Elinor directly for the first time. For our son. Understand, Miss Ashworth, that if he is disowned, if his father follows through on the threats I know are forming in his mind even now, you would be choosing a life of far greater uncertainty than the one you currently know, however diminished your circumstances have already become. Alina lifted her chin, meeting the Duchess's assessing gaze without flinching. I did not ask him to come here, Your Grace, she said clearly. I did not ask him to end his betrothal or risk his family's disapproval on my behalf. I have spent these past weeks building a quiet, honest life for myself, entirely separate from any expectation of his return. But he came regardless, and he has been honest with me in every way that matters, and I find that I love him in return, not for his title or his fortune, but for the man he has shown himself to be beneath both of those things. If that is not enough to satisfy your family's expectations, then I am truly sorry for it, but I will not pretend to feel differently simply to make this conversation easier for anyone in this room. A long silence followed her words, and Alexander reached over, taking Alina's hand in his own without hesitation, a small gesture that carried enormous weight in front of his parents. The Duke's jaw remained tight, but something in the Duchess's expression had shifted noticeably, softened by an honesty she had clearly not expected to encounter in this confrontation. This is madness, the Duke finally said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness. The scandal alone could damage this family for a generation. Or, the Duchess said slowly, surprising everyone in the room, it could be remembered very differently, depending on how it is handled. A duke who chose love and honesty over a cold arrangement, who stood by the woman he cared for despite scandal and disapproval, is not a story society will necessarily condemn if it is told correctly, and if the two of you conduct yourselves with the dignity this family has always represented. The Duke turned to his wife with obvious surprise. You cannot be suggesting we simply accept this. I am suggesting, the Duchess said, rising from her seat with quiet authority, that our son has made his choice, and has made it with more conviction than I have seen from him in years. We can spend the next months fighting a battle we are unlikely to win, watching our relationship with our only heir deteriorate beyond repair, or we can choose, difficult as it may be, to trust that he has found something worth building a life around. I did not marry for love myself, Charles, and I have often wondered what my life might have looked like had I been given the choice our son is now fighting so hard to claim. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, studying his son and Alina with an expression that had finally begun to soften from its earlier fury into something closer to reluctant consideration. This will not be easy, he said finally. There will be talk. There will be those in society who never fully accept this match, whatever explanation we offer. I am prepared for that, Alexander said firmly. I would rather face difficulty honestly, at Alina's side, than spend my life pretending contentment with a choice that was never truly mine. The Duke looked toward Alina one final time, his expression still guarded but no longer entirely hostile. And you, Miss Ashworth, are you prepared to face what will certainly be a difficult road ahead should this proceed? I have already survived the worst that scandal can offer, Your Grace, Alina said steadily. I do not think I fear what remains as much as your son might imagine. Something that might almost have been the beginning of respect flickered across the Duke's stern features. He said nothing further on the matter that day, choosing instead to retreat to his own thoughts. But in the weeks that followed, word gradually spread through both London society and the quiet Yorkshire village that the Duke of Jedburn intended to marry not Lady Priscilla Grant, but a young woman named Alina Ashworth, in a match that had begun in scandal, but was slowly, carefully, being reshaped into a story of courage and honest affection triumphing over cold arrangement and rigid duty. Alina's own family received the news with a complicated mixture of relief and disbelief, her father's earlier fury softening considerably at the prospect of his daughter becoming a duchess, rather than remaining a source of ongoing scandal, though Alina found, to her own quiet satisfaction, that she no longer needed his approval as desperately as she once had. She had built in the quiet months of her exile a strength and clarity of purpose that no longer depended entirely on the opinions of others, however powerful or influential those others might be. Edmund Clark, when he learned the full truth of what had transpired, offered his sincere congratulations to Alina with a grace that spoke to the genuine friendship they had built, though a quiet sadness remained in his eyes that Alina recognized and gently acknowledged before their final conversation as unmarried friends. "I am glad," he told her, "that you have found the happiness you deserve, Alina, whatever form it has finally taken. I hope you will remember, occasionally, the quiet village that gave you shelter when you needed it most." "I will never forget it," Alina promised him sincerely. "Or you, Edmund. You showed me a kindness I did not fully know how to receive when I first arrived here, broken and uncertain of my own worth. I will always be grateful for that." In the spring that followed, Alina Ashworth married Alexander Vane, Duke of Jedburn, in a ceremony far smaller and quieter than society might have expected of such a match, held not in the grand cathedrals of London, but in the modest stone church of the very Yorkshire village where their reunion had first taken place. Constance Hartley stood proudly among the small gathering of guests, having played, however unknowingly at first, a crucial role in bringing together two people who had refused, against every expectation placed upon them, to let duty and scandal separate what honest feeling had joined. As Alina walked from the church on her husband's arm, past the familiar market square where their eyes had first met again after weeks of painful separation, past the river path where their careful courtship had slowly rebuilt itself beneath bare winter branches, she thought of how differently her life had unfolded from the ruined future her family had once feared for her. She had been sent to the countryside to forget a man she was never truly meant to forget, and in the quiet, unassuming corners of that remote Yorkshire village, she had found not only the courage to remember him, but the strength to claim, openly and without apology, the life and the love that had always been meant for her. The first months of their marriage were not without difficulty, exactly as the Duke had warned. London society, accustomed to arranged matches built on fortune and lineage, took time to warm to a duchess who had arrived among them trailing whispers of scandal rather than an impeccable pedigree. Alina faced cold receptions at several early gatherings, felt the sting of whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room, and endured more than one carefully worded insult disguised as polite conversation from women who had once counted themselves her friends, before the scandal had separated her from their circle entirely. Alexander stood beside her through every uncomfortable evening, refusing to let her face the quiet cruelty of society alone, and slowly, gradually, the tide of opinion began to shift. It helped in no small measure that the Duchess of Jedburn, once she had fully accepted her son's choice, threw the considerable weight of her own social influence behind the new couple, hosting a series of carefully orchestrated gatherings designed to showcase Alina's genuine warmth and intelligence to precisely the audience most likely to matter for her long-term acceptance. Within a year, the whispers had largely faded, replaced instead by a kind of grudging admiration for a duchess who had, by all accounts, won her position through courage and honest feeling rather than calculated ambition. Lady Priscilla Grant, whose broken betrothal had initially fueled much of the early gossip surrounding the match, surprised everyone, perhaps including herself, by eventually becoming one of Alina's most unexpected allies. She called upon Alina directly, several months after the wedding, in a visit that Alina had approached with considerable apprehension, only to discover that Priscilla harbored far less resentment than she had feared. "I will admit," Priscilla told her over tea with a candor that surprised them both, "that I was hurt, initially, more by the manner of the ending than by the ending itself. Ours was never a match built on affection, Your Grace, whatever London might have assumed. I have since found, quite unexpectedly, a gentleman of my own whose company I genuinely enjoy, something I never truly experienced with Alexander despite our years of arrangement. I find, looking back, that I owe you and your husband a strange sort of gratitude for freeing us both to find something more honest." Alina found herself laughing with genuine relief at this unexpected confession, and the two women, once positioned by circumstance as rivals, gradually developed a cautious friendship that neither of them had anticipated when their strange connection first began. Eleanor's own family took longer to fully reconcile with the dramatic turn her life had taken, though the transformation from disgraced daughter to duchess softened her father's lingering resentment considerably faster than Eleanor might have expected. Charles Ashworth, who had once spoken of ruin and disgrace with such bitter conviction, found himself, within a year, boasting quietly to acquaintances of his daughter's remarkable marriage, a shift in attitude that Eleanor observed with a mixture of amusement and lingering hurt, understanding all too well how quickly her family's love had once seemed conditional upon her usefulness to their reputation. She forgave him, in time, though she never again allowed his approval to hold the same power over her decisions that it once had. Her mother, Helena, proved a more consistent source of warmth throughout the transition, writing regularly, visiting whenever her health and circumstances allowed, and taking genuine, uncomplicated joy in her daughter's happiness that Eleanor treasured deeply. Her sisters, too, benefited unexpectedly from the connection, finding doors open to them in society that might otherwise have remained closed, and Eleanor took quiet satisfaction in knowing that her own difficult journey had, in some small way, eased the path for those she loved most. Constance Hartley remained a constant presence in Eleanor's new life, a frequent guest at Jedburn House despite her initial protests that a countrywoman of modest means had little business mingling among London's grandest families. Eleanor insisted, every time, that no gathering felt complete without her aunt's dry wit and steady wisdom present to balance the sometimes overwhelming formality of ducal life, and Constance, though she grumbled good-naturedly about the fuss, never failed to accept the invitation. Edmund Clark married, some 2 years after Eleanor's own wedding, a kind and clever young woman from a neighboring village, and Eleanor received the news with genuine warmth, sending along a generous gift and a heartfelt letter of congratulations that spoke to the true and lasting friendship that had survived, transformed but unbroken, beyond the brief complication of unspoken feelings that had once threatened to strain it. Alexander, for his part, harbored no jealousy toward the doctor's son, who had offered his wife such genuine kindness during her darkest weeks, understanding fully how much that steady friendship had contributed to Eleanor's healing during a period when he himself had been unable to offer any comfort at all. The village itself became something of a cherished retreat for the young couple, who returned often in the years that followed, staying at Constance's stone house rather than any grander accommodation, walking the same quiet lanes where their careful courtship had first been rebuilt beneath bare winter branches. Eleanor never lost her fondness for the small, unassuming corner of Yorkshire that had once felt like a punishment, and had instead become the place where she discovered her own strength, her own worth, entirely separate from the glittering world of London that had once defined her every waking thought. 3 years into their marriage, Eleanor gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Constance in honor of the aunt whose quiet wisdom had steadied Eleanor through the most uncertain period of her life. The Duke, once so consumed by duty and expectation, proved a devoted and unexpectedly playful father, spending hours in the nursery despite the raised eyebrows of more traditional members of society who considered such involvement beneath a man of his rank. Eleanor watched him with their daughter, remembering the guarded, careful young man who had first spoken to her in a candle-lit alcove years before, and marveled at how completely honesty and courage had reshaped both their lives from what duty alone would have made of them. Looking back, in quiet moments during the years that followed, Eleanor often thought of that terrible night when her father's carriage had carried her away from London in disgrace, certain that she had lost everything that mattered most to her. She thought of the long, lonely road to Yorkshire, of the tears she had refused to shed in front of anyone who might use them against her, of the quiet, ordinary life she had slowly built for herself in a village that had asked nothing of her except honesty and effort. She had believed, in those early weeks, that she was learning to forget the Duke of Jedburn, to accept a smaller, safer version of happiness than the one she had briefly glimpsed in that candle-lit alcove. Instead, she had learned something far more valuable. She had learned that her own worth did not depend on the approval of a society quick to condemn and slow to forgive. She had learned that true happiness could not be built on duty alone, whatever the pressures of family and position might insist. And she had learned, most importantly of all, that sometimes the very thing a family sends you away to forget is precisely the thing worth remembering, worth fighting for, worth risking everything to reclaim, when it returns to find you exactly as it had promised it would. They never spoke of the scandal that had once threatened to define them with shame or embarrassment. Instead, in later years, they told the story of their courtship to their children as a tale of courage rewarded, of two people who had refused to accept the easy, expected path when their hearts had so clearly pointed toward something better, something truer, something worth every difficult step of the long road that had finally, against every expectation, led them home to each other.